Chapter 60. No Other Gods. In a very important study, Ernst F. Kevin wrote on the moral law, that is, God's law. He pointed at once to the departure of the Church at times from the truth of God's law. Quote, "At various periods in the history of Christian doctrine, it has become necessary to reaffirm the truth that the ministry of the law has been divinely ordained as a means of grace for the sanctification and godly walk of the believers. This, of course, carries with it no denial that the only sufficient power for sanctification is the indwelling life of Christ in the believer by the Holy Spirit. This is sanctification through faith, and it is one of the great glories of the Christian gospel that it does not merely tell men to be good, but enables them to be so. What is it that pleases God? The doing of His will. Where is His will to be discerned? In His holy law. The law, then, is the Christian's rule of life, and the believer finds that he delights in the law of God after the inward man. Romans 7:22. The Christian is not lawless, nomos, but, quote, under the law to Christ, end quote, a phrase from Paul which would be more accurately rendered, quote, in the law, nomos to Christ, end quote, 1 Corinthians 9:21. Sin is lawlessness, anomia, and salvation is the bringing of the lawless one into his true relation to God within the blessedness of His holy law. The law of Moses is none other than the law of Christ, end quote. Kevin held, quote, all goodness is summed up in the law, and there is nothing that can be conceived of as good which is not contained within it, end quote. The law is given for all men, the godly and the unjust. It was given by God's grace to show men the way of justice. Moreover, quote, the law is established by the gospel, end quote, in three ways. First, Jesus Christ established the law in respect of its penalties by satisfying God's justice. Second, He fulfilled its requirement of perfect obedience. Third, the gospel establishes the law by giving the believer, quote, grace in some measure to fulfill the law, Romans 3:1-31, end quote. If the law is abrogated for believers now, it must have been abrogated to believers in the Old Testament era. Now, Kevin's perspective was obviously biblical and held to the validity of God's law. God being God has of necessity the law-making power as creator and governor over creation. If God is not recognized, then man and the state must seek another source for the law. In the autumn 1986 issue of the journal, Social Philosophy and Policy, the subject of the symposium is, quote, philosophy and law, end quote. Most of the contributors are professors of law. As reputable modern scholars, they do not consider God as a source of law. Nature gets a passing nod, but law is essentially a human construct and therefore necessarily a matter for human determination. One of the professors uses as an illustration the moral necessity for obedience to a traffic red light in the desert as against one at a crowded urban intersection. In the desert, with no car in sight, a flat terrain and no police helicopter, there is no moral reason to stop, or is there? Donald H. Regan's wrestling with this question is not our concern here, but rather the purely humanistic approach. We are in the moral world of Raskolnikov in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. A red light in the desert is a somewhat artificial illustration. Dostoevsky gives us a more realistic one. Should a person, even if they have not broken the law, be killed because they are socially useless and even possibly evil? Who determines the right to live, God or man? Framed this way, the moral question applies to abortion. In the early years of abortion, at times the pro-abortion advocates, in anger, would cite the high black birth rate and low social value of the ghetto black and like arguments to justify abortion. Their racist frame of mind was obvious, and of course the origins of the movement were clearly so. The basic issue, however, goes beyond that. It is whether or not God permits abortion or any law that encroaches on His prerogative or violates His law. Clearly, God, as a jealous God, does not regard man's lawmaking as anything but rebellion and warfare against him. Kevin's premise, quote, all goodness is summed up in the law, and there is nothing that can be conceived of as good which is not contained within it, end quote, is basic. God's law begins with this fundamental premise: Thou shalt have no other gods before me, Exodus 23, which means also this: Thou shalt have no other laws before me. Other laws mean other gods, whether we admit it or not. These other laws may be statist or church law, but unless they are faithful applications of God's law, they are an affront to God. H. Rondell Rumberg has said, quote, men who do not bow to God will be bound by man. Also, it is better to obey God rather than man, end quote. The alternative to the rule of God and his law is always slavery, and slavery is the present direction of too many men and nations.